The crack of the auctioneer's gavel echoed through the sweltering heat of Dustbrook's main square like a gunshot, but Clara Thompson barely flinched. She had grown numb to the sound over the past hour as her father's belongings were sold off piece by piece to settle his mounting debts. The mahogany desk where he had written his letters. The leather-bound books that had taught her to read. Even his pocket watch, the one thing she had begged them to let her keep. Now she stood on the makeshift wooden platform, her hands bound behind her back with coarse rope that had already begun to chafe her wrists raw. At 19 years old and nearly 6 feet tall, Clara towered over most of the men in the crowd, her unusual height making her an even more conspicuous spectacle. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on her auburn hair, and she could feel rivulets of sweat trickling down her spine beneath the faded blue dress that had once belonged to her mother. Sheriff Cornelius Wade wiped his brow with a stained handkerchief and cleared his throat. The man's belly strained against his vest buttons, and his eyes held a cruel glint that Clara had learned to fear over the past 3 weeks since her father's sudden death from fever. Wade had wasted no time seizing their small homestead for unpaid taxes, and when Clara had nowhere to go and no male relative to claim her, he had invoked an old territorial law that allowed for the auctioning of destitute women to ensure they wouldn't become a burden on the town. "Now then, gentlemen," Wade's voice boomed across the square, his tone carrying the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to wielding power over the desperate. "We have here Miss Clara Thompson, aged 19, in good health despite her unusual proportions. She can read and write, tends house adequately, and comes with a strong back for farm work." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the assembled crowd of about 30 men. Most were local farmers and ranchers, their faces weathered by years under the harsh Texas sun. Clara recognized several of them, men who had once tipped their hats respectfully when she walked to town with her father. Now they studied her with the calculating gaze reserved for livestock. "What am I bid for this woman?" Wade continued, his voice echoing off the false storefronts that lined Dustbrook's dusty main street. "Remember, gentlemen, marriage or indenture, whatever arrangement suits your needs. She'll work hard and ask for little." Clara felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she forced herself to keep her chin raised and her gaze fixed on the distant horizon where purple mountains shimmered in the heat haze. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I'll start the bidding at $20, called out Marcus Brennan, who owned the largest cattle ranch in the county. Clara had always found him unsettling, the way his pale eyes seemed to undress every woman they fell upon. "Though I admit, that height might be more trouble than it's worth." Several men chuckled, but no other bids came immediately. Clara's heart began to race as the silence stretched on. $20 was already insultingly low, but the prospect of belonging to Brennan filled her with dread. "Come now, gentlemen," Wade cajoled. $20 for a woman who can reach the top shelf without a stepladder. Think of the practical advantages." More nervous laughter, but still no competing bids. Clara could see the uncertainty in the men's faces. In a society that prized delicate, petite women who needed protection, her imposing height made her an oddity rather than a prize. $15. Brennan revised his bid downward, his tone suggesting he was doing the town a favor. Wade frowned but nodded reluctantly. $15 from Mr. Brennan. Any other bids? The silence that followed was deafening. Clara could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. She closed her eyes and tried to summon her father's voice, the way he used to tell her that her height was a gift, not a curse. "You can see further than most folks, Clara girl," he would say. "That means you can see trouble coming, and you can see opportunity too." $10, came a reluctant voice from the back of the crowd. $5, another man offered, his tone suggesting he was bidding more out of pity than genuine interest. Clara's throat tightened. She was watching her worth as a human being diminish in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The rope around her wrists seemed to grow tighter with each declining bid. $2, called out old Samuel Hutchins, the town drunk, generating a few uncomfortable chuckles. "Though I suppose that's about right for damaged goods." Wade's face had grown red with frustration and embarrassment. A failed auction reflected poorly on his authority, and Clara could see him struggling to maintain his composure. "Surely someone can do better than $2 for a woman in her prime," he said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. The crowd had begun to thin as men drifted away, their interest waning. Clara could see some of their wives watching from the boardwalks, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and relief that it wasn't them standing on that platform. "Going once for $2 to Mr. Hutchins," Wade announced, though his tone suggested he found the whole situation distasteful. That's when Clara heard the jingle of spurs on the wooden boardwalk behind her. The sound was distinctive, different from the heavy work boots of the farmers and ranchers. These spurs sang with each step, a musical quality that spoke of fine craftsmanship and frequent use. The crowd began to murmur and shift, their attention drawn to someone approaching from behind the platform. "Going twice for $2, Wade continued, but Clara could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. The footsteps stopped, and Clara felt rather than saw a presence behind her. When the stranger spoke, his voice was low and measured, carrying easily across the square despite its quiet tone. "I'll match that bid. $2. Clara turned her head as much as her bound position would allow, catching a glimpse of dark hair beneath a worn black hat and a long duster coat that had seen better days. The man stood with an easy confidence that suggested he was comfortable with being the center of attention, though she couldn't make out his face from her angle. Wade's expression shifted from frustration to wariness. "I don't believe we've been introduced, stranger." "Name's Jack Morrison," the man replied, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Even she had heard of Jack Morrison, the notorious outlaw who had been robbing trains and banks across 3 states. The bounty on his head was said to be over $500, dead or alive. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd as recognition dawned. Several men began backing away slowly, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Clara could see Wade's hand hovering near his gun, but the sheriff made no move to draw it. Morrison had a reputation for being quick on the draw and utterly ruthless when cornered. "Mr. Morrison," Wade said carefully, his earlier bluster completely vanished. "I wasn't aware you were in these parts." "I go where the wind takes me, Sheriff," Morrison replied, his tone conversational. "And today it brought me to your little auction. $2 is my bid." Wade looked around the square, clearly hoping someone else would speak up and relieve him of having to deal with the dangerous outlaw. But the remaining spectators had fallen silent, their earlier amusement replaced by palpable tension. "Well," Wade stammered, "Mr. Hutchins bid first, so technically—" "Hutchins," Morrison called out, his voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "You looking to compete with me over this purchase?" The old drunk had gone pale and was already shaking his head vigorously. "No, sir, Mr. Morrison. She's all yours." Clara's mind reeled as she tried to process what was happening. Of all the possible outcomes she had imagined for this humiliating ordeal, being sold to one of the most wanted men in the territory had not been among them. She had heard stories about Jack Morrison, whispered tales of his violent exploits, and the trail of bodies he had left across the frontier. Some said he had once gunned down an entire sheriff's posse single-handed. Others claimed he had burned down a church with the congregation still inside. But looking at him now, she found herself confused by the contradiction between his fearsome reputation and his actual appearance. He was tall, though not as tall as she was, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around him without revealing his thoughts. His face was weathered but not cruel, and when he caught her staring, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was almost courtly. "Sold then," Wade announced quickly, clearly eager to conclude the proceedings. "To Mr. Morrison for $2. Morrison reached into his vest pocket and produced $2 silver, which he tossed to Wade with casual indifference. The coins caught the sunlight as they arced through the air, and Clara watched them land in the sheriff's outstretched palms with a soft clink that seemed to echo her father's final words about her having value beyond what small minds could see. "Much obliged, Sheriff," Morrison said, stepping up onto the platform behind Clara. She tensed as she felt his presence close behind her, expecting rough hands or harsh words. Instead, she heard the soft whisper of a knife being drawn from its sheath. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice so low that only she could hear it. The rope around her wrists parted cleanly, and she felt circulation returning to her hands in a rush of painful tingling. She rubbed her wrists, staring at the angry red marks the rope had left behind. "Can you ride?" Morrison asked, still speaking quietly. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Her father had taught her to handle horses, though she had never owned one of her own. "Good," he said, then raised his voice to address the crowd. "Thank you all for the entertainment, but I believe we'll be moving along now." He gestured toward the edge of town where Clara could see a magnificent black stallion tied to a hitching post outside the saloon. The animal was clearly built for speed and endurance, its coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. Beside it stood a smaller chestnut mare that looked equally well cared for. As they walked through the dispersing crowd, Clara became aware of the whispered conversations following in their wake. She caught fragments of speculation and fear, men wondering what Morrison intended to do with his unusual purchase and whether they should form a posse to pursue him. But she also noticed that none of them made any move to actually confront the outlaw, and Wade had already disappeared into his office. When they reached the horses, Morrison untied both sets of reins and handed her those belonging to the mare. "She's gentle but spirited," he said, patting the horse's neck affectionately. "Name's Daisy." Clara stared at him in bewilderment. "You're giving me a horse? Well, you can't very well walk where we're going," he replied, swinging easily into his saddle. "Unless you'd prefer to stay here and see if Sheriff Wade changes his mind about the auction results." The threat implicit in his words was clear. Wade might be too cowardly to confront Morrison directly, but once the outlaw was gone, there would be nothing stopping him from claiming Clara had been acquired illegally and putting her right back on the auction block. Or worse, keeping her for himself. Clara gathered her skirts and managed to mount the mare with reasonable grace despite her shaking hands. She had expected the animal to be difficult to handle, but Daisy responded to her touch with surprising gentleness. "Where are we going?" she asked as they began to ride out of town. Morrison glanced over at her, and for a moment she thought she saw something almost like kindness in his dark eyes. "Somewhere you can decide for yourself what you're worth," he said. As they rode north out of Dustbrook, Clara turned in her saddle to take one last look at the town where she had spent her entire life. The sun was beginning to set behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. She could see a few people still standing in the square, probably discussing the day's strange events. In the distance, smoke was rising from the chimney of what had been her family's home, now occupied by strangers. She faced forward again, her hands gripping the reins tightly as they rode toward an uncertain future with a man whose reputation marked him as one of the most dangerous criminals in the territory. But as the familiar landmarks of her childhood fell away behind them, Clara found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in weeks. For the first time since her father's death, she was not entirely without hope. The mysteries surrounding Jack Morrison's true intentions, the reasons behind his unexpected act of what could only be called rescue, and what he meant by helping her decide her own worth would have to wait for answers. But as they rode into the gathering dusk with the vast Texas landscape stretching endlessly before them, Clara allowed herself to believe that perhaps her story was far from over. Perhaps, in fact, it was just beginning. The campfire crackled softly in the darkness as Clara pulled the rough wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. They had been riding for 3 hours before Morrison finally called a halt beside a small creek hidden among a grove of cottonwood trees. The location was well concealed, suggesting he had used this camping spot before, and Clara wondered how many other desperate souls had shared this same fire with the notorious outlaw. Morrison sat across from her, methodically cleaning his Colt revolver with practiced efficiency. The firelight played across his weathered features, casting dancing shadows that made him appear both younger and older than she had initially judged. He had spoken little during their journey, offering only brief directions about the terrain and warnings about low-hanging branches. Now, in the intimate circle of firelight, the silence between them had grown heavy with unasked questions. Why? Clara finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison looked up from his weapon, his dark eyes meeting hers across the flames. Why what? Why did you buy me? Why risk coming into town when half the territory is hunting you? She paused, gathering courage for the question that had been gnawing at her since they left Dust Brook. And why haven't you touched me? A ghost of a smile crossed Morrison's lips, though it held no warmth. You think I spent $2 just to have my way with some unfortunate woman? Men have done worse for less, Clara replied, surprised by her own boldness. The events of the day had stripped away many of her polite pretenses. Morrison set his gun aside and reached into his saddlebags, producing a small leather pouch. From it, he withdrew what appeared to be an old daguerreotype, its edges worn from frequent handling. He studied the image for a long moment before extending it toward Clara. Her name was Sarah, he said quietly. My sister. Clara accepted the photograph with trembling fingers. The image showed a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Morrison, though her features were softer, more delicate. But what caught Clara's attention immediately was the woman's unusual height, clearly visible even in the formal portrait pose. She appeared to be nearly as tall as Clara herself. She was beautiful, Clara said, meaning it. She was strong, Morrison corrected, his voice carrying a weight of old pain. Stronger than anyone gave her credit for. But this world doesn't have much use for strong women who don't fit its narrow ideas of what a lady should be. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. What happened to her? Morrison stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. She was 21 when our parents died of cholera. Left her alone with debts and no male relatives to speak for her. Sound familiar? Clara's throat tightened as she began to understand. The town council in Cedar Falls decided she was too much of a burden on the community. Too tall, too proud, too independent for any decent man to want to marry. So they arranged for her to be sold to a mining operation up in Colorado Territory. Told everyone it was for her own good, that she'd have steady work and a roof over her head. But it wasn't, Clara whispered. It was a death sentence. Morrison's voice had grown harder, edged with old rage. Those mining camps, they chew up women and spit out what's left. I was barely 18, working cattle drives and trying to save enough money to bring her home. By the time I got to Colorado, she'd been dead 6 months. Typhoid, they said, though the other women in the camp told me she'd been worked near to death and worse. Clara felt tears burning her eyes as she looked again at the daguerreotype. The young woman staring back at her from the past seemed to be pleading for justice, for someone to care that her life had mattered. I'm sorry, Clara said, handing the photograph back to him with gentle care. Morrison tucked the image back into its pouch with the reverence of a man handling a religious relic. That was 7 years ago. I've been looking for a way to make it right ever since. Is that why you became an outlaw? The first man I killed was the mine foreman who worked Sarah to death, Morrison said matter-of-factly. After that, there didn't seem much point in trying to stay on the right side of the law. The law hadn't done much to protect her. Clara felt a complex mixture of sympathy and fear. She was beginning to understand Morrison's motivations, but that didn't change the fact that she was alone in the wilderness with a man who had just admitted to multiple killings. As if reading her thoughts, Morrison reached into his vest pocket and produced a small cloth bag that clinked with the sound of coins. He tossed it to her, and she caught it reflexively. There's $50 in there, he said. More than enough to get you to San Francisco or Denver or anywhere else you want to start over. The mare is yours to keep, and she's worth at least another $30 if you need to sell her. Clara stared at the bag in her hands, confusion washing over her. I don't understand. Tomorrow morning, we reach a crossroads about 10 miles north of here. One path leads to Mexico, where a man can disappear if he knows the right people. The other leads to Sacramento, where the railroad can take you anywhere in the country. Morrison leaned back against his saddle, his eyes never leaving her face. The choice is yours, Clara Thompson. For maybe the first time in your life, the choice is entirely yours. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. Freedom. Real freedom, not just the illusion of it. The chance to determine her own fate without interference from sheriffs or town councils or well-meaning relatives. "What if I chose to go with you?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Morrison's expression grew serious. "That's not a choice I'd recommend. The life I lead, it's no life for anyone who still has options. Eventually, they'll corner me, and when they do, anyone standing beside me will likely end up dead or wishing they were. But what if I chose it anyway?" For a moment, something flickered in Morrison's eyes that might have been hope, quickly suppressed. "Then I suppose we'd face whatever comes together." Clara pulled the blanket closer around herself and stared up at the star-filled sky. The vastness of it no longer seemed threatening as it had during her father's illness when she had felt so small and powerless. Instead, it felt full of possibilities, of destinations she had never imagined reaching. As she drifted off to sleep beside the dying fire, Clara realized that for the first time in her life, she was looking forward to tomorrow. Not because she knew what it would bring, but because she finally had the power to decide for herself. The mystery of Jack Morrison might be solved, but the mystery of Clara Thompson was just beginning. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, both of their futures stretched out like unmarked trails across the vast frontier, waiting to be explored by two souls who had finally found the courage to choose their own paths.